last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that took place here that are manifesting in many different ways in different parts of the world, here in our country and in other countries. Really a beacon of hope and inspiration for people to accomplish the same type of thing, which is at least a commitment to equality for all.
This is a unique moment, I think, for the area. I think for the state. Tourism has evolved within the last 5 years, and so this really creates an opportunity for us to stand in this moment and be a beacon of change for those throughout the world.
For more than 20 years, the Civil Rights Institute educated people all over the world about what happened here in the 60s and the ramifications of those actions and behaviors, not just in Birmingham, but across our country over the course of the last 50 plus years. I think where we're going as an institute is to really be a beacon of hope for people grappling with whether it's civil rights, equality, the same types of issues that.
Greetings. Welcome to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's virtual conversation. Today, we are talking about the March on Washington, policing and criminal justice, and we have a very talented group of panelists today. And so I'm going to give you all the opportunity to introduce yourself. Chief, we're going to start with you.
Hi,
and also tell us. Well, I was going to say, also tell us how long you've been in your career.
Good afternoon. My name is Darnell Davenport. I'm a deputy chief with the Birmingham Police Department. I've only been in Birmingham for about 18 months. Prior to coming to Birmingham, I was with the Los Angeles Police Department. I was there for about 31 years. I left the Los Angeles Police Department as a captain. In the position that I was in as a captain, I was responsible for community outreach and development division. And so I was really responsible for the city of Los Angeles Police Department outreach and community policing strategies in that city. I bring many of those same talents to the city of Birmingham. I'm a police professional, and I'm committed uh, for all and fairness in terms of how the police department shows up in all communities.
All right, Mr. Johnson.
Good afternoon. My name is Brandon Johnson. I serve as the director of the Mayor's Office of Peace and Policy. I joined the Woodfin administration in March of 2018. Prior to that, I worked in various capacities in public policy and planning in Illinois and Chicago, and I've been in this profession for 20 years now.
Great. So we're just gonna start rolling into some questions. To our general public, if you all have any questions, please put those questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to get to them. So just starting off, so the reason why this program is called the March on Washington is because on tomorrow they will be celebrating an anniversary of the March on Washington from 1963. It's the 57th year anniversary with the National Action Network. And they're planning a march on tomorrow to talk about policing and law enforcement and how we can make changes in those avenues. So my question is, what does it say to you that more than 5 decades later, after that eventful march on Washington in 1963, that we are back to that same spot with a call for equality focused on law enforcement? What do you think that says to you all, that we're still having to handle or deal with these same issues all these years later? Go ahead, Mr. Johnson. We'll start with you.
Okay. I think what it says is that we need to, as a community, as a nation, one, keep up the fight, but two, be more thoughtful about what it means to have structural change. And so I think the fact that we're having some of these same issues and battles is because structures and institutions are persistent. And we have to be diligent in terms of how we address those issues on a systemic level. And we can't just let it be a moment. And so I think in this moment, and my hope for the march tomorrow and going into November is that, you know, beyond our emotions, we look at our institutions and push for solutions and changes at the institutional and structural level so that we're not dealing with these same issues 50 years from now.
Chief Davenport, what do you have to weigh in on that?
You know, I think it's sad that 57 years later, we're still having the same conversations. I think that's sad that the center of most people's attention today is what it was 57 years ago. It's the police department. And unfortunately, police departments are not evolving as quickly as they need to evolve. And I think what we look at is that often there's systemic problems which are not being addressed in a broader sense. And often police departments are the first responders to incidents where maybe they should not be the first responders. We have to look at healthcare. We have to look at education. We have to look at homelessness. And we have to figure out what the police department's role is as it relates to that. But we should not necessarily be the first responders. Other parts of government have to show up. And we need systemic change so that when there is a homeless person that is having a mental health crisis, that we send the appropriate persons to address that particular issue. And so, unfortunately, what has happened over the last 20 years or so is that police departments have become the first responders. And they don't necessarily have all the tools and the training to effectively address these kinds of situations. But I will tell you, is the fact that we are having these conversations, the fact that we are looking at the systems, there's hope for improvement. And there is a hope that in 50 years, or even within the next few years, that the issues that we're addressing now will not be the issues that we'll have to address in 2025. And so I'm glad that we're having these conversations because these are worthwhile conversations. And my hope is that the change that we do put in place is good change. And we have to take our emotions out and make really good decisions.
I agree. Very insightful thoughts. Really quickly, I want to know what are you all's thoughts on qualified immunity? And qualified immunity, let me give you the Wikipedia definition. Is a doctrine where it grants government officials performing discretionary functions immunity from civil suits unless the plaintiff shows that the official violated clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. It goes into a lot more, but I kind of want to get you all's take on qualified immunity, and is that part of the problem?
I'll go first if you want me to.
That's fine.
I think the police departments should keep it. We should have qualified immunity. Police work is often, it's not pure science. Decisions are often made on the spur of the moment. And police officers need the ability to have discretion in terms of the decisions that they make. And I think at some point, those decisions should be viewed by the court, and the courts will determine whether they're going to have the immunity or not. But as it stands now, I think that it should stay in place because the reality of it, this is not pure science. We're dealing with people, and you have to give people parameters to be able to work in so that they can be effective.
This is actually something that our office is looking at right now. There was actually a decision not too long ago, the last couple of weeks, from the Southern District of Mississippi. And so addressing qualified immunity. So it is something that has kind of become a beast of its own, and has, like Chief Davenport said, our first responders need protection to do a dangerous job, right? And they operate in spaces where, but for qualified immunity, they wouldn't be empowered to respond to some of the things that we want to respond to. But I think the more interesting conversation around qualified immunity is where it arises from. So qualified immunity actually arises out of the Fourth Amendment, which is protection against unreasonable search and seizure. And so I think that we have to be thoughtful about the Fourth Amendment rights of citizens and make sure that while we do have the doctrine of qualified immunity, that the policies governing city employees protected by qualified immunity also balance the rights of the individual. And so I think when I hear qualified immunity, I think it's a balancing act between protections needed for government to do difficult jobs and the constitutional rights of individuals to be protected against unreasonable search and seizure.
Wow. Okay. That kind of segues me into another question that I'm really curious about as well. And that's the concept of this blue wall. The blue wall is often used to describe law enforcement's failure to hold their own accountable for misdeeds. What, if anything, can be done to address this concept of the blue wall? And Chief Davenport, let me start with you on that one.
It's really about leadership. Police chiefs have to make the right decisions for the right reasons. And if they make the right decisions for the right reasons, many of the issues that we're having, those issues will dissipate. When we have an incident where an officer is involved in the use of force, we have to evaluate that use of force. And we have to look at every component of it, the tactics leading up to the use of force and the actual tactics in the use of force. And if the officer is found to have behaved inappropriately or less than what is expected from them, we have to have those serious conversations with them. We have to provide better training. And then not only do we have to provide better training, we have to hold them accountable to the training. We have to have expectations. And sometimes being a leader in an organization, it's very difficult because sometimes you stand there by yourself. But at the end of the day, as a law enforcement professional, it is our responsibility to protect the people. And by protecting the people, sometimes means you have to stand there by yourself. And you have to make those very difficult calls. And so not only looking at leadership, we have to make sure that we're selecting the right folks to become police officers and that we're doing good background investigations and that we're constantly evaluating our people, that we're providing constant training to improve and evolve the way they do policing. The way we did policing 10 years ago is certainly not the way that we do policing today. And so it's an evolution that constantly needs to be fed with new information, new ways of doing things. We have to constantly challenge ourselves and be responsive to the communities that we work in.
Brandon, did you have anything you wanted to weigh in on that one?
The only thing that I would add to what Deputy Chief Davenport said is transparency. I think one of the benefits of technology like body cameras is I think the more transparent, the more eyes that we have on the street to both monitor crime but monitor officers helps to kind of break that down, right? I think transparency and kind of sunshine around these acts is what breaks down that kind of institutional culture that has existed in a lot of police departments in the past.
I agree. This is a tough question right here, and I want you all to kind of help me out with it. But so the existence of systemic racism has been debated in political circles in today's climate. It's been debated for years and years, honestly. But do you agree that systemic racism exists? And if so, do you acknowledge its existence in law enforcement? And go ahead, Brandon, we'll start with you on that one.
I mean, the short answer is yes, right?
Right.
Definitely exist. There are kind of schools of thought or historical analysis that say that the way that our police departments evolved were out of the paddy rollers and the slave patrols, right? And so we do have a system of policing that, because of the fact that enslaved Africans were considered chattel and property, a system of policing that was initially only designed to secure property was extended to persons, and primarily, those of us of African descent. And so a lot of the structures used to enforce racism still persist today. And, it is through leadership like that of Mayor Woodfin, that of our police chief, Patrick Smith, that allows us to reform and redirect the energies of our institutions. But the fact of the matter is, your police force was developed right along every other racist structure that exists in this country. And it's incumbent upon us, particularly those of African descent, to be direct and intentional in dismantling some of those structures in the way that they evolved.
Excellent point. Deputy Chief?
And I think Brandon is absolutely right. I think as police departments, we constantly have to look at our policies. We have to look at our practices and how we show up in the community. I believe that racism, systemic racism, does exist. And we often have to evaluate what we're doing. Because as we evaluate what we're doing, things that we thought might have been okay, we find it's not okay anymore. And so life is constantly changing. And so the evaluation of our tactics, our policies, how we interact with the community constantly have to be on the table. We have to be in front of things and make those changes before they become problems. And so we have to be visionaries. And often, as a visionary, sometimes you stand there by yourself. But as police chiefs, as deputy chiefs of police, as mayors, we have to move these organizations forward into the right direction. And we need to do it based on constitutional law. We need to do it on just based on what we think is right as people. Because at the end of the day, when you're stopped by a police officer, you want to be treated right. Everybody deserves that. I mean, that is just basic police service. You want to be treated right. And so constantly here in the Birmingham Police Department, we constantly evaluate our tactics. We constantly evaluate our approaches. And we are very aware of how the community perceives us. And so consequently, we want to be very responsive because at the end of the day, we need to have public trust. And if the public does not trust us, our ability to be effective as a police department is significantly diminished. We are often not there when incidents occur. We often show up after the incident. And we have to have a community that is willing to approach us, then tell us who was involved and tell us what happened.
That was excellent. And that segues right into my next question about the trust gap between the community and law enforcement. How can we bridge that trust gap? And do you think that having officers that live in the communities that they police is a means to do that? Chief Davenport, we'll go with you this time.
Well, I think that there is a trust gap. And the last couple of years I've spent in Los Angeles, I really tried to address that. We've had community policing for a number of years. It is not a new terminology. How community policing shows up in different communities is often different. But at the end of the day, we ask, is community policing effective? I will tell you that it is effective, but we constantly have to evolve what community policing is. Because at the end of the day, there are still too many communities and too many community members that don't trust the police and will not engage in the police. It's sad, but often you will be in uniform and you may go to a restaurant and a parent may say to their child, if you do something wrong, I'm going to get that police officer on you. And so from a very young age, there are community members who believe that it's okay to tell a 5 or 6 year old that if they do something wrong, I'm going to use the police officer to be the bad guy. That diminishes trust from a very early age in terms of police youth relationships. And so we have to do things, we have to think out of the box, and we have to constantly change how we perceive community policing to be. But at the end of the day, our challenge is, and always will be, to constantly evolve community policing strategies to touch the community. I will tell you a very quick story is that if you looked at Mayberry back in the day in Andy Griffith, that was real community policing. And that if something happened in that town, they would always go to the sheriff and tell him what occurred. And we want to be at that point in this great city that we work in and that we call Birmingham.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is, in order to bridge this gap, we're going to have to honestly deal with the fact that it is a kind of cultural phenomenon and it's bi-directional, right? And I think that's one of the hardest things to do is we often don't ask enough, why does the community feel like that? And, we put a lot on the police department, but I think there are discussions that we need to have, particularly in some of our high crime Black communities, about why is this the attitude that we have? And I won't opine on what that is, but I think it starts with us. We have to empower ourselves. The police work for the people. And part of that distrust is you abdicating or giving up the power that you actually have to direct your police department, right? And so we have to stop departing from these positions of deficit and recognize that we, the people, are the bosses. And if we want a different police department, we need to be engaged and direct that police department to do different things.
Let me say one quick thing. I want to say one quick thing, and Brandon's absolutely right. Police officers are public servants. We are here to serve the public, and the public has to tell us what they want so we can deliver the service that they need in their communities. And we are responsive, and we're always listening because we want to be responsive to all the communities.
Well, that's great. Most people are familiar with Bryan Stevenson and the work that he does. Recently wrote a book called Just Mercy. And one of the statistics that's cited in that book talks about the mass incarceration rate in the United States of America. And so what does it say to you that we incarcerate a quarter of all the people in prison globally, considering that we're only about 5% of the world's population? Whoever wants to jump in, that's fine.
I mean, that goes back to some of the structural racism issues that we're dealing with. The fact of the matter is, Mayor Woodfin and Dr. Mark Wilson, Chief Medical Officer of Jefferson County Department of Public Health, declared violence in our city a public health issue. And part of the reason for that is, and this is going back to the 80s and 90s, where the CDC understood that a vast majority of your crime was actually a public health issue. And, it's just wrong-headed that we believe we can incarcerate our way out of stuff. I think what I would say, and there's so much to say about mass incarceration, but the thing that I would flag the most is the tremendous amount of trauma it inflicts on individuals and communities. The fact of the matter is, mass incarceration is also a criminal factory. It doesn't just destroy communities, it destroys individuals. And part of what we have to do is why Mayor Woodfin has his Office of Reentry, is we have to deal with those individuals with a full recognition of what they've been through. The fact of the matter is, we sit here in the state of Alabama, the Department of Justice wrote a scathing report about the Alabama Department of Corrections and the conditions in the prisons. I think the most profound aspect of that report was that they said the Alabama Department of Corrections constitutes a violation of the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. So sending people is not just, a matter of justice. We're saying that this is a constitutional violation of the rights of individuals. And then again, with the trauma, we're breaking people. And then we're putting them into our highest risk communities and expecting them to function as though nothing had happened. So it is a huge problem. And it's probably in a lot of ways, our prison system is the #1 driver of crime in our community.
Wow. Chief, what do you think about that?
Well, I have to agree with a lot of the points that Brandon made. I think he articulated really well. I think it is a public health crisis. A lot of issues that we have in many communities are tied to narcotics. It's tied to addiction issues, whether it's narcotics, whether it's alcoholism, whether it's cycles of violence that thrive in some households, whether it's mental illness. But there's a lot of issues that are all, at the end of the day, tied to health. And I think that there needs to be better intervention, better prevention programs, and reentry programs. And we have, as a country, have to do a much better job as it relates to addressing and dealing with the health issues that affect so many of us. And often in some communities, people live in places where they often hear gunshots. You're 5 and 6 years old, 7 years old. How does that impact you? And we know that at some point it does impact you. And if you see violence in the street and you're a young person, 8 or 9 years old, and you now are 15 or 16 and you're involved in some kind of dispute, do you often go back to what you've already seen? This is a health crisis. And so certainly we have to look at how we better utilize mental health and different types of health systems to help us to resolve some of the issues related to crime.
That's great. So what I'm hearing is basically that that trauma can be generational, right? That trauma can be passed down generationally, and so people are dealing with the same trauma that their family may have been dealing with for years. And I'm also hearing that we need proper resources and proper responders for whatever that problem may be that the police are being called out for, because always it's not a police issue. Does that make sense? Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And so
Okay.
when you look at police response, if you're responding to a mental health crisis, you probably need a mental health professional there. If we're responding to a person that is homeless, then you probably need a homeless advocate there. One of the things that we're looking at right now is a domestic violence response car in Birmingham. So if you're responding to a domestic violence incident, you need often wraparound services. What we've found, unfortunately, too often is that there are victims of domestic violence in Birmingham that have called the police department maybe 20 times or 25 times in the last 2 years. And so we can't keep doing the same thing and expecting a better result. And so consequently, we're in conversations right now to try to change how we respond to these incidents. There are people in the community that need help. And the way that we're delivering the help is not necessarily the way that they need the delivery to be made. And so we want to change how we're doing it so that we can be more effective as a police department. And at the end of the day, we have to serve that person that's the victim of domestic violence. And I don't think that we're serving that person in the best way if we continue the same response protocol.
No, that's great. I agree wholeheartedly. And because basically what I'm hearing also is that the police need help. They need help from the qualified professionals for a number of different situations that they have to walk into every day. So what is your thoughts on calls for people to defund the police? What does that mean to you, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think that defunding the police is the appropriate thing. I think that the police departments need to be funded appropriately. We need training. We need to have mental health advocates actually working for the police department. We need to have homeless outreach folks working in the police department. And so it's not necessarily defunding the police department. The chief here would often say refunding the police department. We have to better train our people, and we have to bring in those skill sets that we don't necessarily have that we already don't have in the police department into the department so that they can help us with these different kinds of incidents. Because at 2 o'clock in the morning, when someone's having a mental health crisis, they usually cannot call a mental health counselor at that time. But if we already have that person embedded or in the police department, that person can now respond with a police officer to start addressing some of those issues. And the reason that you often need a police officer there because there is a potential for violence, and the police officer is there to ensure that the situation is going to be safe so that the technician, the mental health provider, can provide the kind of services that are needed. And so I think that we just have to do a better job in funding our police departments, providing the training and the resources so that police can be more responsive. And I think if those things occur, I think that you'll see a significant improvement in police community trust.
Man, I guess what I would say is, I'll respond to the question by saying what I hear when advocates call for defunding the police. What I hear is the need for a more expansive approach to public safety that does not just invest in the police department, right? Because there are a lot of things that we can do to have a safer community that are upstream. You know, everything from education and workforce development to better quality housing. I think all of those things, you know, from a public health standpoint, they talk about social determinants of health. And there are certain things that we know that if we make certain investments, we can prevent individuals from going down a pathway that leads to involvement with the criminal justice system. And so I do agree that it's not just a matter of funding, it's a matter of consciously and strategically aligning all of the instruments of government to create a safer community for everybody. And that's what I hear when I hear defund the police.
Excellent points. This next question is kind of dear to me personally. I can remember the day that my mom sat me down and started to have a conversation with me about if I ever have a run-in with the police, this is how you're supposed to function. I'm originally from California, Chief Davenport. I grew up in San Bernardino, California, about 45 minutes east of LA. Grew up in gang culture and in a gang-infested neighborhood. And so I believe my mother knew inevitably that you were going to have a run-in with the police. And so the question is, are you all familiar with the talk that parents of minority children are having concerning police interactions? And what are your thoughts on this talk? And what would you advise parents to include in these conversations? We can start with you, Brandon. First of all, let me ask you this really quick before you get going. Has anyone given you the talk? And then
Absolutely.
I just want to make sure. And then
it's par for the course, right?
Exactly.
So this is actually near and dear to me too, because I'm also a criminal defense attorney. So no, we should not have to give each other the talk. However, what I would always tell my clients is you can't win the case in the streets anyway. I think at the end of the day, while we're working on fighting structural racism and this, that, and the other, just get home, live to fight another day. That's the point blank period, you know. And there's so many factors that play into why it's so dangerous to be out in the streets and have encounters with the police when you're Black. But I think practically speaking, make it home. And, you know, particularly if I'm talking to a young man, like, you're not going to win this fight. You're not. And I mean, particularly on the heels of, you know, yet another shooting in, you know, Wisconsin, I'm just about us preservation of life. Let's fight them in the courts. Let's fight them in the proper venues where we can win. But I think do whatever you got to do to get home to your family, period.
Before you start, Chief Davenport, I kind of want to piggyback off of that a little bit. In my many years on this earth and talks with police, my grandfather was in law enforcement for over 40 years. You always hear police say, make it back to your family. Make sure you get back home. And to hear Brandon say exactly the same thing for those people that those police officers will be interacting with, we all want to get home to our families. But I just wanted to make that point that it's the exact same rhetoric that I've always heard police officers say, you know, I got to make it home to my family. And so I just wanted to kind of point that out real quick, Deputy Chief, before you answer the question about the talk as well.
You know, I will tell you, and I'll really speak from the bottom of my heart. It is sad. I've had to have that same conversation with my family members. I had the same conversation that I was growing up. And I will tell you, spending most of my adult life in police work, my hope is that when I had entered this profession a little over 30 years ago, that today we would not have to have those kind of conversations. But the sad reality is that we're still having those conversations. And it's a conversation that no one should have to have with their family members. And I think that as community members, we need to be able to feel safe when we're stopped by the police. And we also need to feel as that we're being stopped in a way that is justified. And unfortunately, many people in the African American community have these conversations. And I will tell you, as a law enforcement professional, and I would piggyback on what Brandon said, the thing is that you need to comply with the officer's directions and instructions. That is not the time to have an argument at 1 o'clock in the morning on a dark, dimly lit street. You can address if there are issues at a later time. And my hope is that maybe in the next 5 years or sooner, that this conversation that we're having with our loved ones won't be a conversation that we will need to continue to have. And so my hope is that through public education and looking at policing more closely, that we can make significant change.
All right, really quick, and this may be a hard question to answer, but because we live in an urban center here in Birmingham, and I know Los Angeles is a pretty large urban center as well. But do you see the mission of policing to be the same in urban and suburban setting? And if yes, are the approaches the same? Why or why not? Do you police people in suburban areas the same way you police people in urban areas? And if so, why is that the case?
Well, let me say policing is essentially a science. And so strategies and techniques in terms of reducing crime are the same. However, you do have to tailor your approaches to the specific communities that you're working with. The laws are the same in all the states generally, but you might have to be more responsive to certain parts of the community because they have different issues that are going on in that part of the community. For example, you may have part of the community that does not speak English. And so consequently, you're going to have to put people in that community that have the ability to speak Spanish so they can communicate with the people in that neighborhood. And so policing is not totally the same in terms of how we apply policing. It has to be specific to the community that you're working in. And so whether you're working in an urban core or a suburban area, it really doesn't matter. People are people, but you have to approach people in a way that is, at the end of the day, regardless of the community, it has to be respectful. It has to be from a position of that you're a servant. And I think that people are in any community, whether it be our urban community or a suburban community, people are going to respond to that. Because when people call 911, they want help. And so police officers, when they show up, and regardless of the community, need to be able to provide the assistance that that community needs. And if you do that from the bottom of your heart and you believe that you're truly a public servant, regardless of what community you're policing in, you're going to be effective.
Brandon, did you have any comments on that question?
I mean, again, it goes to issues of structural racism. So the answer is the policing the same? No, but as Deputy Chief Davenport said, the communities aren't the same. Right? So I'll probably work this from two angles. One, particularly urban communities of color, something that we don't do well, and let's just be honest, is self-police. Right? So some of our norms beg the presence of police. I told you I'm a criminal defense attorney. Most of us did it. So we need to throw some of that mythology, out of the window, right? Like, a lot of this is not harassment, though the harassment is egregious and often deadly when it does happen. It is not the majority of the policing that is happening. Most of it is happening because of behaviors that are happening in our community. So first and foremost, if part of how we can improve policing of our community is better self-policing of our communities and our behaviors. But then the other side of it is kind of along the lines of what Michelle Alexander talks about in New Jim Crow, is yes, it's not the police, it's the court system, it's the system as a whole, right? So a lot of disparities that you see is because poorer people, in particular poor Black people, don't have access to good representation. We don't have, and luckily that's changing, we have people like Lanice Washington and Danny Carr, who are now our district attorneys. But in the courts, we didn't have the kind of representation from the prosecutor to the bench to give us the benefit of a doubt. Whereas some of our, fellow Americans that live in suburbia had judges and prosecutors that looked at them sympathetically, and so a lot of this requires us to look at the criminal justice system in totality. And, the note I made to myself when you asked that question, that's why we got to vote. Who are we putting in the positions to make the laws and execute the laws is the biggest thing. It sucks getting arrested. It sucks having a negative experience with the police. But what really messes your life up is going to jail. What really messes your life up is the charges you get. And so I also would say that the way that things are prosecuted and adjudicated also drives how things are policed. So we need to think about this in the context of the complete criminal justice system.
So let me just give an example though about urban and suburban settings. So when I first moved to Birmingham about 15, 16 years ago, I was really surprised that they were having like stop points or checkpoints or little areas where they would stop people and check their make sure that they had car insurance or things like that. And when I see that that's them trying to happen on a crime. But in places like Mountain Brook or Homewood or other suburban areas, you don't see those type of checkpoints and stoppages like that where you're kind of just trying to find something. To me, that's a difference in how people are policed. And like you said, Brandon, it does have something to do with the community's culture or some of the things that the community itself shows a blind eye to or allows to occur. But why is it that you see those type of things in more urban settings, but you don't see those type of things in more suburban areas?
I'm going to defer to Deputy Chief Davenport, but I will say something right quick is, you also got to look at Mountain Brook doesn't have the same number of homicides as Birmingham. I heard Chief Smith say something, the police chief of Birmingham Police Department say something one time. He said, guns don't fly, right? So a lot of these, and as Deputy Chief Davenport said, policing is a science. And so once you get certain types of crime being prevalent, then certain types of policing will also follow that. And so I wanted to speak first because that in terms of that balance, we have to be real with ourselves, and so to that point about self-policing, if we get these homicides down, if we get these shootings down, then we have a leg to stand on about policing techniques that are not proportionate to the crime we're seeing, and so I do want to be mindful of that so that I didn't want to put Deputy Chief Davenport in a position where he's just defending it. Like, no, there's stuff that drives why they do stops.
The only thing I would say is, and I concur with Brandon, different communities have to be policed a little differently. There's some communities that are having a disproportionate number of crime. And so consequently, we're going to put more resources to deal with that particular issue in those communities. I will tell you, because of the driver's license checkpoint, when we look at our overall traffic collisions in the city, they're down about 32%. When we look at the number of traffic collisions where people are seriously injured or death occurs, they're down about 30%. And so when we look at our overall violent crime in the city, we're down almost 27% in our total crime in the city. And so what we're trying to do is do things that are going to be effective. And yet we want to ensure that we're doing things which are constitutionally allowable. And so it's one of the strategies that we use. And I will tell you that if you were on the fire department and there was a fire in your neighborhood, you would want the fire department in your neighborhood putting out that fire. You wouldn't want them driving in another neighborhood where there's no fire, and yet they're not putting the resources where they need to be. And I don't know if that was the perfect example, but what I'm trying to say is that we're trying to tailor the policing strategies and techniques to deal with the particular crime problems that we're having in our community. And unfortunately, in the city of Birmingham, we do have a lot of violent crime that involves guns. And we're trying to get to those guns to prevent people from being victims of violent crime. But we want to do that in a constitutional way. And what we often find is that people that don't have driver's license, they don't have insurance, those are often people also that will have guns in their cars. They're not going to abide by the law. And if we can prevent one child from being shot or killed, that's our charge. But we're going to try to do it respectfully. We're definitely doing it respectfully, and we're going to do it within the confines of the Constitution of the United States. We want to do it right.
One of the things that we've kind of been talking about throughout our conversation today is about the community getting involved in policing themselves and helping do some of the work that the police are called out to do. But this question is about what we know as vigilante justice. How do you feel about vigilante justice or community members who feel that they have to help the police or basically police themselves, but on a different kind of level? These are people who want to, go out and fight crime themselves instead of allowing the police to do it. What do y'all think about that?
Well, I
Um,
think,
Go ahead,
go
Deputy
ahead.
Chief.
Well, I think if you want to help the police, then you come down to the police station and you volunteer. We have things that they can do. We don't need independent folks going out there with guns deciding that they're going to police the community. Unfortunately, that always leads to a bad outcome. And it's going to be a bad outcome for the vigilante, and it's going to be a bad outcome for the community member that they come in contact with. And so if you want to be involved in the police department, we have a million things that you can do. We invite you to come and help us police the city in a very proactive way. We're in the process of starting a Safe Passage in a few weeks. And Safe Passage we're going to put adults and they'll be along the route that kids travel to school. We need volunteers for that. And their jobs are to be the eyes and the ears of the police department. And if they see something that's going to occur that might affect the child, to give us a call. See, kids have a problem getting to school and they have a problem getting home. If we get them to school, the likelihood of them being involved in criminal activity is significantly decreased. If we get them home, then they're more likely to come back to school the next day. And so there is an opportunity for residents of this city to get involved in this police department in a real way. And we need people to be involved in our Safe Passage, which we want to start. We wanted to start weeks ago. With COVID-19, we've had some delays. But if you want to be involved, give us a call because there is an opportunity for you to help this police department in a real way.
And I'll be short. I think, particularly given, the two protesters that were murdered this week in Wisconsin, we have to have zero tolerance for it. It is such a slippery slope that I think, zero tolerance is the way to go with vigilantism.
And I'm glad you said that, Brandon. That segues right into my last couple of questions. So the first question that I have is, when we do see something like what happened in Wisconsin with the young man Jacob Blake, and the community kind of gets in an uproar, how would the police department or police departments want the public or the community to respond to things that they see like that they consider an injustice or a wrong? How do you want people to respond to those type of situations?
Well, I think peaceful protest is your constitutional right. So I 100% respect lawful and even spontaneous protests so long as they're peaceful. But I guess the other side of it is every time I see this, I think about for the city of Birmingham, how do we get upstream? Meaning that part of the reason that you're seeing this protest is they don't feel that within the city there are mechanisms for them to address their grievances in a way that's satisfactory. And so when I see those protests, I feel myself pushed to come up with solutions to engage community upstream so that, God forbid, something like that does happen, the community has enough faith and trust in the government that they can go directly to them without the need to protest, right? So every time I see a protest, it means there's been a breakdown between the people and their government that needs to be fixed. So it's really about how do we create opportunities upstream where that kind of critique is always happening and discussion is always happening between government and the community it serves, such that ideally, when Jacob Blake was shot, the people should have been like, well, we know if we go to this office in the mayor's office, or we go to the police department, they're going to handle it. They didn't have that confidence. So I think it's incumbent on us to instill that confidence in our community that when something happens like that, they know it'll be addressed.
You know, and the thing I would add on very quickly is that people have to have confidence in the police department. We have to be responsive. And just in that case, where with vandalism, people also have to have a confidence in that if they're a victim of another crime, whether it be a shooting, whether it be a burglary, that they can come to us and that we're going to effectively investigate that and take their concerns seriously. And I will tell you, in this police department, if you come to us and you report a crime, we're going to do everything in our power to try to resolve that. Because at the end of the day, we're public servants, and that's what they're expecting. They're expecting a police department that's going to be responsive to their concerns and to the crime problems that are occurring in the neighborhood.
That's great. I really enjoyed our time today. Last question, and then I don't mean to single Chief Davenport out, but this question is something that that myself and my colleagues were really thinking about, and I'm really curious to know that how do you reconcile being a law enforcement professional by day, but a black man all the time? Once you take that uniform off, how do you reconcile that, where you may be perceived as, you know, a threat or something when you have that uniform off, like the rest of us black men in America? So how do you reconcile it? I know that's kind of a tough question, but I'm really curious on, you know, how do you feel about that?
You know, it is a tough question, but it's a real question. And I will tell you that my charge in the time that I've been a police professional is trying to make sure that the police officers who work around me, the police officers who I've trained, that they're of high quality, they're of high character, and that they do the right things for the right reasons. And so at the end of the day, what I want to do when I leave this profession is leave it in a better place than when I found it. And that's the challenge. And it's a constant challenge. And as you look at the news and you see reports of police being involved in some of these incidents, you cringe, because you want better for the profession. You want the profession to be respected. And I will tell you, we constantly have conversations with the people in this department about what it means to be a police officer. And at the end of the day, it's about public service. And we got to remember that. And people expect us to show up in a certain way. They expect us to be a certain way. And we have to live up to what the expectation is. And it's a difficult expectation. And when I take off this uniform, if I get stopped by the police, I want to be treated with respect and courtesy. In fact, I'm going to pretty much demand that I be treated with respect and courtesy, because that's what everybody wants. I don't want anything more than what anybody else wants. And it's just to be treated with respect and courtesy. And that's very important to me. And the older I get, I will tell you, it becomes even more important.
Wow. Excellent point. I just want to thank you all today for taking time out of your day to be a part of this conversation. Hopefully we can rely on you all to come back and talk to us again in the future. For all of those that are watching, please tune in next week, September 3rd, for our program called Bring Power, Economics, Race, and Wealth. We have an exciting group of panelists to talk to us along those lines next week. Please go to our website, www.bcri.org, for also future programming and also free resources and information, not only with our oral history project, but also educational resources as well. So once again, thank you all
Thank
for coming
you.
out. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one.
You too. Be safe.
Thank you.